Good evening, everyone. Believe it or not, we're still working out just a few logistics. So bear with me as I figure out what my instructions are. Yeah. Am I okay like this, or should I be over there?
No.
Is that all right? All right.
How's that going to work for you?
Delighted to see that so many people agree with me that it would be a shame to waste a beautiful evening like this at home. Thank you all for coming out. I have no idea how many people are tuning in on their computers, but based on our experience with our association, there's for everyone here, probably a couple billion out there watching. So this is really something to be excited about. My name is John Parker. I'm flattered to have been invited to play this role for this evening's gathering. I'm part of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, which has had a very strong, somewhat symbiotic relationship with the Friends of Egerton Ryerson ever since we got started. And our group has taken a lot of inspiration from the work that the Friends have carried out, and I'm pleased to be part of this one tonight. Are we okay?
Oh, now you're.
So the people at home, I guess, were spared listening to all of that.
We have to go up there.
So I'm essentially tagged as host this evening, but you know what?
There's a mic there. People really need to hear you on a mic.
So that I don't forget to do it before we're done, I'll do it now. The chair of my association, the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, is with us, Gordon Walker. So Gordon, can you just stand up and let everyone know who to send the checks to? And I propose to introduce our panel now, because I'll forget to do it later on. In order, we have Betty Trott, Ron Stagg, Lynn, McDonald, and Art Eggleton. Betty Trott is a professor emerita of philosophy from well, it says here Ryerson University, and that's what I'm going to call it. She's co-author with Leslie Armour of the first book on the history of philosophy in English-speaking Canada, titled The Faces of Reason. He has recently presented several philosophy conference papers that have supported Egerton Ryerson and his legacy. She completed her BA and MA at Victoria College here on campus. So you know she's quality stuff. Ron Stagg is currently a professor at the aforementioned university and has served more than 30 years with a specialty in 19th century Ontario, which is somewhat appropriate to tonight's topic. He has twice served terms as chair of the Department of History at his school and is one of the co-founders of the Friends of Egerton Ryerson. Lynn McDonald is a professor emerita of sociology at the University of Guelph, a climate activist and former member of Parliament. By the way, if I read her full CV, that would take up all the time available to us. So we just keep it tight for the sake of keeping to an agenda. And I hardly need to introduce Art Eggleton to anyone in this group, but I wonder if anyone could imagine the years of public service he's put in. 45 in total, starting as a member of the City Council in 1970, becoming mayor of Toronto and served there as 1980 to 1991. And if my understanding is correct, nobody has served as mayor of Toronto longer than Art Eggleton has.
You usually get rid of them faster. It took a while with me.
He was a member of Parliament from 1993 to 2004, including serving as a cabinet minister for 9 of those years. And he still wasn't done after that. He went on to the Senate from 2005 until retirement in 2018. Which I think at some point they make you retire whether you deserve it or not.
That's right.
So we're delighted to have him with us tonight. And I think everyone in this room knows how pleased we all were that he and 2 other former mayors signed a letter that we thought was pivotal in the story that played out over the past year on a subject that troubles us, but we're here to talk about. Let me begin then with introducing Betty Trott, who will speak on the matter of patterns of historical truth.
I feel sort of weird. I remember marching outside this building back in the late sixties when they wouldn't let women into it. And we would protest up and down the streets, and now I'm on the inside of it. It's the first time. Truth in history. Can you hear me okay? Do you want me on the mic?
Online.
You okay?
There's people online.
You want the mic?
Hello there.
That better?
Okay.
Truth in history has been and continues to be debated. How many books would you have to read to know the truth about the cause of the Second World War? Both historians and philosophers have confronted the idea of truth because facts can be ignored, taken out of their specific time context. That is, they can be interpreted from a different time context, such as the present one, or used for purposes other than seeking and sharing truth. Two examples of philosophers' comments on historical truth are, in Collingwood, The Idea of History, he wrote that history is about interpretations. He distinguishes history from science, noting that science expects to repeat an event, but history can only try to imagine the event based on factual evidence. Canadian historian, formerly from U of T, Michael Bliss, he wrote, every sentence historians write begs issues about the use of evidence and contains judgments about relative importance. There has also been an evolution of concepts, resulting in what Harvey Graff in his book, Labyrinths of Literacy, called the creation of meaning. Graff lists disciplines that continue to escalate meanings, and so bury the idea of truth. Things like cultural history, intellectual history, literary criticism, cognitive psychology, cultural anthropology, just a few of the subjects that are out there to confuse things. So should we interpret the past through the increased number of new disciplines in the sciences and in the social sciences, or work with the meanings of events as they existed in a particular time, assuming we can determine their scope? One response is to recognize truth as patterns of relations between and among facts and events. And let's consider an example of patterns of relations with Egerton Ryerson. When Ryerson University changed its name, part of the reasoning made public was a reference to Egerton Ryerson's use of the word savage. But what meanings and what context, that is, what relations, made the word part of Ryerson's vocabulary? The word savage has evolved from early Greek and Roman words associated with lives in the woods or on the land or outside of the city. It has expanded its meanings over time to include wild and then vicious, and now active, alive, and free. Here are two examples which help confirm the patterns of meaning regarding the word savage in Not Yet Canada. Author Susanna Moody, who arrived in Canada in the 1830s, in her book, I'm sure you've all heard of it, Roughing It in the Bush, she wrote about the Indigenous peoples, and I quote, "The Indian is one of nature's gentlemen. He never says or does a rude or vulgar thing. The vicious, uneducated barbarians who form the surplus of overpopulous European countries are far behind the wild man in delicacy of feeling or natural courtesy." Such observations are confirmed by Elizabeth Heman in her recent book, "In a Civilization from Enlightenment Philosophy to Canadian history. She tracks the meaning of the word civilization. And she writes, to be an Indian in settler Canada was to be perpetually on an unstable, if not violent, frontier. This disorder emanated from settlers rather than Indigenous inhabitants. A considerable amount of research has been done by an American colleague of mine, Robert Timko, in Pennsylvania. Timko observes that Ryerson used the word savage in The Elements of Political Economy, a book Ryerson wrote, where it appears 8 times over 168 pages. And in his book, The Story of My Life, Ryerson used the word heathen, originally from German and Dutch, meaning lives on the heath or on uncultivated land. Professor Timko has published a recent article on Ryerson with a Russian colleague of his, Alexander Kubushkin, in a Soviet journal. And if you want anything of this, the information about that article, I have it with me, and there is a website where you can read it in English. There is no context in any of Ryerson's writings that suggests a derogatory use of the word savage. Rather, there is a pattern of description of Indigenous peoples living in the woods and needing help in acquiring education, including farming skills. And you will hear much more about Ryerson's relationship with the Indigenous people from my colleagues here this evening. The Toronto Metropolitan University is promoting a meaning cruel or vicious, for a word taken out of its original context, and blaming Egerton Ryerson for something he never proposed or wrote about: the cruel and destructive circumstances that developed in the residential schools, mainly under the administration of religious orders. The purposes of the schools in the hands of future decision makers shifted tragically from the free education Ryerson promoted to forced cultural destruction, a serious diversion from his original visions. Establishing the pattern of meanings for words, such as savage, and their role in the contribution of facts within a specific time context is an essential but often disregarded task in the pursuit of historical truth. Thank you.
In a classic case of bait and switch, you were promised Professor Peter Russell, you're going to get me. The idea was that Peter would follow up after the outstanding on-ramp that Betty just gave you and give you a detailed account of one particular case study of exactly what she described. And that's the life and work of Peter Jones. Now, I wondered, have you got the picture on file there? If not, it doesn't matter, I've got the book.
Okay.
Sorry, John, I should have.
That's okay. Now, I don't propose to apply for the job of president of Harvard, so I'm quite happy to admit where I got all my information from. This here book, written quite some time ago, actually, by Donald Smith. I think this came out in 1995, so it's not new information. Tells the life story of a contemporary of Egerton Ryerson. His name is Peter Jones. That's his English name. His father was an American surveyor who came to Canada after the War of Independence. His mother was a native Mississauga Indigenous person, and he was the offspring of that marriage. He was raised by his mother, as in the Mississauga community. His father, being a surveyor, was off in the woods for long periods of time. So until he was about 20 years of age, he was indifferent to the fact that he had a Welsh and American background. He lived and was raised and was most closely associated with the customs of the Mississauga community. By the time he turned about 20 or so, his father came back home and gave more attention to what he and his brother were doing. And he began to develop the side of him that connected him more with the white settlers in the western end of Lake Ontario. And he had a foot very clearly in two worlds, very much in the Indigenous world and to a strong degree also in the white settler world. And he could speak both languages fluently, which itself was a unique capacity on his part. At the same time as he began to develop his association with his white background, he became very deeply engaged with the Methodist Church, and to the point where he became ordained in the Methodist Church, and he became a missionary. And he traveled throughout a lot of places, but mostly in Upper Canada for the next few years, and took a strong interest in advancing the conditions of his Mississauga colleagues, to the point where he realized that, or he took the view that they were not likely to advance in the changing world unless they learned to live in accordance with the rules that were beginning to take shape in the area of Upper Canada. And he promoted the evolution of the Mississauga tribes from living in the conditions of we call wilderness and into more settled village type settings. And the area that he chose to focus on for the consolidation of the communities was the Credit River. By the way, if you're ever wondering, as I have wondered, where does the name Credit River come from? It's actually, I wrote this down so I would get the actual name. Question is, do I remember where I wrote it? And I won't bother trying to remember where I wrote it. I'll just tell you that the English term credit is the English translation of the Ojibwe term that was used to describe the settlement on the Credit River. And it was so called because that's where trading took place between the white population and the indigenous population. And there was a degree of trust that was associated with what went on there. And the indigenous term was essentially a translation of the English word, the Mississauga word was the Mississauga translation of the English word trust or credit. And so it was from that relationship that we have the term credit. And it's largely as a result of the settlement that Peter Jones established there that we have the town of Port Credit and we have the port at Port Credit. So he established a community there and changed the way his people lived. Instead of being scattered all over the place and living off the land as they found it, they marked out plots, put up fences, built homes rather than communal living and temporary wigwams and so on. They built log cabins and single-family dwellings, and they evolved from a polygamous relationship to monogamous relationships, all part and parcel of the Methodist side that Peter Jones was bringing forward. The name Sacred Feathers, by the way, before I forget to mention it, that was also his name. He had three names. He had an English name, an Ojibwe name, which Ojibwe was the larger group of which the Mississaugas are a part, and also a Mohawk name. But his Ojibwe name translates to English as Sacred Feathers, and that's why the remarks here concern Peter Jones, aka Sacred Feathers. He was a contemporary of Egerton Ryerson's, and they were collaborators. So I just want to give you a few comments here that appear in writing on that point. Of all the Methodist missionaries that Peter knew, Egerton Ryerson became his closest and most loyal friend. During his very first week among the Credit River Indians, Egerton Ryerson learned how well Peter had organized the community. The young Methodist preacher had called for subscriptions to pay for the construction of a permanent joint church and school building, and they went about doing that, and in a matter of months, the funds were raised and a church was built. Having once, back to Egerton Ryerson here in his relationship with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Having once worked for half a year with a carpenter, Egerton Ryerson proved a very practical helper at the Credit. He showed the congregation how to undertake basic carpentry, to plane boards, shingle roofs, and make window frames and log floors. In the fields, he also took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and showed the Indians how to do things with their own hands. Peter Jones was thinking of missionaries like Egerton Ryerson when he later wrote, "Such men, and such only, are really calculated to do lasting good among Indians, men who are not afraid to blacken their hands by logging the timber and burning the wood in the field, men who are not ashamed to work in their shirt sleeves, men who do not say to the Indians, 'Go and do this or that,' but who say to them, 'Come on, brethren.' Such men only can convince the Indians that they are their true friends and wish to do them good." That's Peter Jones in reference to his relationship with Egerton Ryerson and the relationship that Ryerson had with his Mississauga community. And this is where another story that you've heard comes from. The Credit Indians became very attached to their young white minister. Captain Jim, once a staunch opponent but now a leading champion of the new faith, approached Egerton Ryerson in mid-December 1826. Ryerson was in his mid-20s himself at this time, as was Peter Jones. The chief, speaking on behalf of the band, said, "Brother, as we are brothers, we will give you a name. My departed brother was named Cheehawk. Thou shalt be called Cheehawk." The name Cheehawk meant a bird on the wing, an appropriate title for the energetic Egerton. So you've probably heard that Ryerson had a very strong, direct relationship with the indigenous community that he served. This is the story right here. The Mississaugas of the Credit, and Peter Jones was integral to that. Now, the story of Peter Jones is absolutely fascinating, and it's worthy of an evening. It's worthy of more than an evening unto himself. But let me just summarize it. He did his best to raise his people to a level of equality with the white settlements around him. He had allies in that effort, Egerton Ryerson foremost amongst them. He also had a number of challenges as well, and that I suppose is a story for another day. But he had struggles with his own people, but he also ran up against some very strong opposition from some of the rascals that we all know about from our grade 5 social studies books. So Francis Bond Head and Bishop John Strawn and characters like that feature in a very big way in the story of Peter Jones. But Peter Jones had one thing on them. They hadn't necessarily met. They'd been invited to meet with King William IV. Peter Jones was. He was a very much sought after speaker. He traveled through Eastern Canada, or at least Upper Canada, giving speeches, basically fundraising, throughout the United States, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, giving speeches, raising money, packing the house with people who came to hear him speak, and a few trips to England where he was a huge hit. And he, as I say, he was invited to meet with William IV, and whichever his wife's name was, I forget his queen. But later he was also invited to Windsor Castle when he met with Queen Victoria. And that wasn't just a courtesy visit. He went to Queen Victoria with the agenda of resolving disputes over treatment of land commitments made in Upper Canada by Governor John Graves Simcoe in the 1870s, which had been steadily ignored and kicked down the road by his successors over time. Interestingly, the folks who you would expect to have good, clean records lost track of the commitments that were made. But the people of the Mississaugas, they didn't forget, and they were constantly reminding the government of the commitment that Simcoe had made to the Indigenous people. And that became the work of Peter Jones's life. What I want to do before I sign off is just touch further on the relationship that Jones had with Egerton Ryerson. Bondhead, by the way, was a jerk. I got to give you this part. And around the time that Bondhead became the governor in Upper Canada, Andrew Jackson had become president of the United States. Andrew Jackson he was another jerk. He had a very simple idea of what to do with the inconvenience of having natives around. Get rid of them. So he was the one who started the policy of removing the indigenous people from east of the Mississippi and just shipping them all off to Oklahoma. Bondhead arrived at about the time when Jackson was doing that in the US. He figured that was a pretty good idea. And his policy was to do something similar here. And that was one of the challenges that Peter Jones had to deal with when he was representing his people in the 1830s. There's another reference I've got here for you here. In due course, the role of the Indian supervisor, which had always been occupied by someone who didn't know anything about the subject matter, became open. It became open because the incumbent got fired because he was found guilty of all kinds of things, including embezzlement of the native funds. That's a continuing theme, by the way. It appears that whoever was in charge of these things found their way to make sure that wherever the money went, they got their fair share in their own pocket. And once or twice they got caught, and once or twice they lost their jobs. So the job of Indian supervisor became open, and Peter Jones figured, well, there's nobody who knows more about all the different Indian communities, all of the issues, and has a better understanding of that and the issues that the Indians have with the government than I do, so I might as well apply for the job. And he got an endorsement from his friend, Egerton Ryerson. Ryerson immediately took affairs in hand, and he wrote, just a word on that. Well, I don't need me to tell you about Ryerson, but I'll give you quote his comments here. So this is a letter he wrote to the chief superintendent of Indian Affairs on behalf of Peter Jones. I take the liberty of mentioning for the favorable consideration of His Excellency the name of the Reverend Peter Jones. I have known him from his boyhood. I was the first stationed missionary among his tribe on the settlement at the Credit in 1826, and had the happiness of being their teacher in the first elements of domestic economy and agriculture, as well as the doctrines and duties of Christianity. By the way, in the world of the Methodist Church in those days, it was all one continual ball of wax. It was all part and parcel of doing the Lord's work and serving the Lord. I was the first station ministry amongst his tribe and had the happiness of being their teacher in the first elements of domestic economy and agriculture, as well as in the doctrines and duties of Christianity. And Mr. Jones was my chief interpreter and most efficient assistant. Since then, he has become an able minister, a well-educated man, a man of large and liberal views. I know of no man whom I think better qualified for the office lately vacated. So, of course, the job went to the lower rung justice of the peace in Sarnia, who was white and had no connection, no background whatsoever with Indigenous people or the issues involving Indigenous people. Some things never change. As I say, we could give a whole evening to the story of Peter Jones' Sacred Feathers and his work, and it is really something to see the role that Egerton Ryerson played throughout the issues and the challenges that the natives, Indigenous people dealt with throughout the work of Peter Jones, and the strong positions that Ryerson took in support of the positions that the Indigenous people had at the time. So of course it makes perfect sense that if you ever see a statue of Egerton Ryerson, knock it down. Ron Stagg.
The subject is the distortion of history. So Lynn and I will say the same thing but different ways. So as an historian, my take on it is historians work from three things. They work from facts, they work from the interpretation of facts, and they work from the interpolation of facts. Now, some facts nobody can question. The day that Canada was created, okay? We're fine with that. But in many cases, fact by itself doesn't mean a lot, and it can be interpreted different ways. Historians do this by taking things in context, looking at whatever else was happening, whatever else the person did, to understand what this means. It's the same thing with interpolation. That is, you're filling in something where the evidence is not there. Historians always cover themselves and say, this looks like what happened. And they will do that again from the available evidence. What we're seeing these days is people taking things out of context and using them for their own purposes. There is a great desire to make up for all the bad things that have happened in society, to find guilty parties. To do that, people will take things out of context and use that for their own purposes. In some cases, they will actually tell, I shouldn't say lies, they will give misinformation, things that are not correct, because it builds up what they're trying to say. So I'm going to talk to you about two characters. I could do others, McDonald, for instance, and show how this has been sorted. Again, I can't go into all of the details, just to give you examples. So we're going to start with Henry Dundas. If you've been following this at all, you know that this all starts from the fact that he injected the word gradual in a bill to abolish slavery. People take that to say he was against getting rid of slavery. And they will go through his long career and try and find other things to support this. In fact, if you look at what he actually did, he was a constant opponent of slavery over and over again. Classic case, a man named Joseph Knight. He was a slave. He was brought to Scotland, and his master got an education, and he discovered that there weren't supposed to be slaves in Scotland. So he said, "Excuse me, I want to be free." A number of, I think, free lawyers took up his case, including Henry Dundas. And the upshot of this was that it was declared that there could not be slavery in Scotland. Another more local note, Henry Dundas appointed the first lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, John Gray Simcoe, who was an ardent opponent of slavery and who did his best to abolish slavery in what was then Upper Canada. I could go through a number of other examples. What people do is to try and find things that can be interpreted another way. So we have here, this is someone from U of T, whose name I will not say. However, the Knight decision had no direct impact on the Atlantic slave trade or slavery in any legal jurisdiction besides Scotland. Yeah. So this is supposed to show that he really wasn't in favor of getting rid of slavery. One other quick example. He proposed a date for abolition 8 years in the future, and eternally in politics, even in the 18th century, which was amended by other MPs in 1796. What actually happened was he came up with a timetable with different marks, that is, different dates, to abolish slavery. The ardent anti-slavery advocates took that and destroyed it because they wanted immediate abolition of slavery. But here, he wasn't really serious about it. And my favorite as a historian, this was during the wars of the British and French, which lasted through from the 1790s into the Napoleonic period. And Dundas prioritized seizing France's Caribbean slaveholding empire, this is a quote from him, with the view of enlarging our national wealth and security. And this person says, gaining control of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the most profitable slaveholding colony of the age, was his central aim. He wanted to get more slaves. If you know anything about imperial history and about the conflict, Britain was trying to destroy the French Empire, to cripple France. It wasn't about slaves. It was about capturing French territory. But you see how it can be twisted? And this is what people who want to blame somebody in the past do. And I'll turn now to my favorite, Egerton Ryerson. Same thing. He was accused of being basically the founder of residential schools, even though the residential schools took place after he was dead. Well, where does it come from? A small group at Ryerson, whatever name, determined that he had a hand in residential schools. People there who wanted to get rid of any vestiges of colonialism decided they should get rid of his name. So they took this up, they got the ear of the president, and there was a plaque put up saying he was responsible for residential schools. If you look at the schools he recommended, he didn't have anything to do with the actual operation. He suggested a curriculum for these schools. But if you look at that, the schools were not the same. They were not the same in what they did, and they were not the same in purpose. They were not to assimilate. They were, John was saying, they were to educate Indigenous people so they could live and compete with the other settlers. But you say, take this out of context? Sure. Nasty man. Egerton Ryerson, in a letter or report which he did for George Varden, the assistant superintendent of the British Indian department is controlled from Britain. Barton was fired for corruption, by the way. Asked him, please come up with a curriculum for the suggested schools, which he did in a letter or a short report. What people don't say is, the year before, this was 1847, 1846, there was a large gathering of different groups of Ojibwe at what is now Emerita. And the government said, we want you to all get together in a few places and live there, and we'll give you schools. And the reply was, we don't want to move, because of course this was to get them out of the way. But we do want those schools. They recognized that if they were going to survive, they needed to learn how to farm, for instance. So they asked for these. And so Ryerson didn't come up with this plan to assimilate them with these schools. He came up with an idea of how they could be educated in agriculture. So the attacks on him then focused on this report. The idea was the government wanted to set up these schools, force them in there, and assimilate them, which was what the later residential schools. But in fact, if you actually look at what he wrote, he said, these people with this education will be able to be the supervisors of large farms or to farm on their own, which is what the government actually promised. So this idea, this is all about assimilation. Now in this letter, he basically said, First Nations, the Indians as he called them, were uncivilized. Oh yes, uncivilized, they're brutes. Except that the idea of civilization meant something totally different back then. There were 3 stages of development. One corresponded to nomadic, one corresponded to hunter-gatherer, and the third one was civilized. This is what Europeans was. They had reached that stage of development. So what he was saying was, they're not there yet. We need to help them get there. Exactly what Indigenous people were saying themselves. On top of this, he said, we need religion. I quote here. This is his report I've got. Nothing can be done to improve and elevate his character, First Nations, and condition without the aid of religious feeling. His influence must be superadded to all others to make the Indian a sober and industrial man. Okay, so he's uncivilized, and he's a broke, and he's lazy. Again, if you put this in context, the Methodists, they were the largest group of this by far of missionaries. They all said the same thing. Because the First Nations had basically lost what they had, they couldn't go out and hunt, they couldn't go out and fish the way they used to, they couldn't roam the land. And they had become dispirited. They become heavily dependent on alcohol, and they had basically just given up. They were actually in a sad state. So when missionaries said, you need to have religion, what they were saying was religion teaches both sobriety and industrious effort. The Mississauga village at the Credit was alcohol free. This is something that Peter Jones insisted on. And he, by the way, was not the only Indigenous minister. There were 40 of them, plus other people who worked in the churches who were Indigenous. This is not one man. People pick on Peter Jones and say, oh yeah, he just gave up. He went along with Egerton Ryerson. So this was what ministers were saying. This is what Indigenous leaders were saying. They recognized they were in desperate shape. And they needed this education. Now, these schools were not the only schools. Okay, there were mission schools in the community. This was in addition. So that people, he specified males, but females, as it turned out, well, they could go there, they could learn education. There was a brief report done at Victoria University, because of course Ryerson founded it, and to me, they said, oh, they were training to be servants, they were training to be workers on the farm. Not true. If you read what's actually there, he said they could become supervisors in large farms, or they could farm on their own. And the government, in fact, had promised them land when they got out of school, which of course government could give them. But the idea here was that these people would get ahead and would be able to fit in with everyone else. George Warden actually wrote to Ryerson and said, excuse me, Ryerson was really busy setting up the education system here, and he didn't get around to answering this. And Varden wrote him and said, hey, look, there are people who want to settle this whole system. If we don't act fast, these people will not have the chance to be the equal of their white brethren. That's what he said. So this wasn't about assimilation, which is what people accuse him of. We're gonna give them religion that'll destroy their culture. They didn't destroy their culture. They added it in. Religion is evil. It's going to crush these people, and not good at all. By the 1830s, Indigenous people had mostly adopted Christianity before all this took place in the 1840s. This actually quite upsets me, because you think about this, what these people are saying is the Methodist Church forced religion on them, they tricked religion on them, whatever. You mean these people didn't have any minds of their own? It's really patronizing to say that they couldn't decide for themselves. The Ryerson started a task force to study the heritage of Egerton Ryerson. One, it admitted that he was a friend to Indigenous people. He had helped the Mississaugas. He interceded in Britain to try to get their land kept, because the land was being taken away in the 1830s, as was mentioned. So the other thing that the task force did was to move away from this idea that he was responsible for resident schools. It doesn't say so, but there is still the original plaque that was put up at Ryerson saying he was responsible. They haven't taken it down. So you have these accusations built on misrepresentation, on taking things out of context. I've seen some really wild things, for instance. One person, Ryerson, claimed that the children were forced into these schools. They weren't. It was voluntary. That was one of the differences. You could go if you wanted to. You could leave if you wanted to. So you would go from your mission school to these if you wanted to learn doing agriculture. But you also got what you would get in regular school system, except adapted to the needs of an agricultural population. Got too many notes here. Well, rather than look, I'll just carry on. So, some people said, you gotta be forced. And others, that Peter Jones was complicit in all this. You know why? Half white. He sold out to his white half. True, I've heard it. The point about Peter Jones was he was one of these people who believed that Indigenous people could only survive if they adapted to the current situation, and they could be just like everybody else in terms of farming and so on, but they would keep their culture. I think Peter Jones would turn over in his grave if he heard somebody saying that he wanted his people to be assimilated. So, just to sum up, what I'm saying here is that people are intentionally picking and choosing facts they can use, in some cases, actually lying, in order to accomplish a purpose, which in that case was to get the name of Ryerson University changed. So I'm sure Lynn will have lots more to say as well. Thank you all.
Yeah, very good.
Thanks, Ron. Let me just add another element to this presentation, and that is very much alive at the time that we're talking about was the debate as to the origin of human races, different races. There's one body of thought that we all have a common origin, and then over time the various races emerged from circumstances of climate and what have you, and the world developed different races in different locales. But there was another body of thought. Science was very much highly regarded at the time. So people were trying to look at things from a scientific standpoint. And a scientific proposition in the anthropological world was that the origin of different races was the origin of different strains altogether. That rather than a common origin that divided into different races, the different races all had their own particular origin. And you take that line of thinking, and it's not a really big stretch to say, well, some humans are different from other humans in a qualitative way because they don't have a common origin. And so there's a reason why we have different stratas for different races. It's natural for things to be that way. Well, this is before Darwin, and before he published The Origin of Species. That came in 1859. So after all of this, so the origin of the species kind of blows that theory apart, that we have separate origins, and he makes the case that of course we all have a common origin. So that won that argument, but it didn't put a stop to the thought that, well, okay, there's a common origin, but then everything's split up, and so there's a qualitative difference to the strains that developed after that. That still remained a hot debate. And I mentioned all this to take it back to the days of Egerton Ryerson. Ryerson was having none of that whatsoever. But he was working in a world where the authorities were very much open to the idea that, well, science teaches us that maybe there are distinct differences, and they're meant to be differences, and there will never be equality, and we're wasting our time trying to achieve equality. That was very much a body of thought that was on the minds of people in positions of authority at the time. It wasn't on the mind of Peter Jones, it wasn't on the mind of the Methodists in Upper Canada, and it certainly wasn't on the mind of Egerton Ryerson. Another reason why, if you see his statue, knock it down. Lynn McDonald.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have the chance to deal with both Dundas and Ryerson. Now, can people hear me, or can I be heard, or can the mic come over here? Because I need to move my slides for the PowerPoint. Thank you. Does that come through?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right. Now, the parallels between Henry Dundas and Egerton Ryerson, they're just so extreme. They were both accused of doing things the opposite to what they did and what their important work was. Here, just a sec. This is not moving along.
Yeah.
It's not moving. Oh. The space key is not working. Or the down key is not working. Okay, well, is it going to work?
Try it.
Okay. Well, okay, so the evidence is clear for both of them. In the case of Dundas, we have all kinds of his words which are in the parliamentary register. It gets taken down in Parliament. Now, it's done in the third person. Mr. Secretary Dundas said, instead of as it would be done in Hansard now, where somebody actually tapes it. But what he said is actually there. Just as in what Ryerson said, we've got the record. We have his life and letters, there are biographies of him, the story of my life. And what he said is there. And he was a friend of Indigenous people. And as mentioned before, he was named a brother. And the case for them both is very, very strong. Now, let me see if I can get to the next slide. Oh, yes. Okay. The accusations are absolutely monstrous. You'll see. This is the slaver one. You see, this is the statute for Dundas in Edinburgh, and the Toronto decision was influenced by the attack on Dundas in Edinburgh. The man who kept slavery going. Well, the accusation was actually that he slowed down abolition, which he didn't do either. But you see, the accusation is even worse. Can I get it to go back up again? Just a second. Yes, okay. The horrific. Olivia Chow said that what Dundas did was horrific. I offered to give her a briefing. I actually know her. Oh, she didn't want one. Nobody wanted one. They're just, their minds were made up. And in the case of the delay, it was a motion that had failed the year before when Wilberforce proposed it in 1791. It would have failed again. And in any event, it wasn't a bill. It could never become a law. It was an expression of opinion. And this is in 1792. We'll see later that the slave trade, it takes decades to get rid of the slave trade. And Dundas was much more realistic than Wilberforce or the other people. He understood that you would have to negotiate with the plantation owners to have it actually happen. And eventually, Britain paid them off. They had to take out an enormous loan to pay off the slave owners. And if they hadn't done it, you wonder why didn't they pay the slaves who'd been unpaid before? Well, if they hadn't paid off the slave owners, abolition would not have gone through, and emancipation would not have gone through. So you have these accusations. Both of them get accused of genocide. And it's just preposterous that, and we'll see this, it's on the plaque. I will deal first with Dundas, but I want to spend a bit more time on Ryerson. Melanie Newton co-chaired the committee that advised on the name change at City Hall. And her report, Empire and Genocide, right in the report, not one direct quotation from Dundas. If you quoted from him, he was so solidly pro-abolition. And then she said Dundas apologists cited 1778 Joseph Knight case, which has already been mentioned. And then she says the 1772 case was more important. Well, certainly was important. But Dundas argued the case so strongly that the law lords, they voted, and note that they voted 8-4. It's not 12-0. Pro-slavery opinion survives for some time in England and Scotland and so forth. But the forces for abolition kept growing, and they were very important. And the 1778 case actually freed all other slaves in Scotland. Probably not a large number, but they were there. Newton stated it was entirely possible to be anti-slavery in Britain while supporting slavery elsewhere. But he opposed slavery everywhere, including in Africa. So the Newton's attack, And she makes the excuse. She never quotes what he says. And basically she's saying, you can't believe what he says because after all, he's a lawyer. A lawyer will do anything to win the case. Well, this was a pro bono case. He's not making any money from it. And because slavery was ended in Scotland by the law lords, there would never be another case, whether it's a pro bono case or a case for money. It's just an absolutely nutty argument. Recognition that Britain led the campaign for abolition. It's simply not there. Britain was in the slave trade for more than 200 years. Portugal got in first, then Britain got in, and it was the number 2 slave trader for a long time. There's no doubt that British slave traders caused enormous cruelty, no doubt about that. But what is different is Britain led the world in getting rid of slavery. Britain only, no other country. And they did it for Britain itself, England first, and then Scotland. Those were judicial cases. And then to get rid of the slave trade itself. Britain led the campaign, first of all, for its own empire, the West Indies and so on, and then further afield. And this is what Dundas said in Parliament. I think you can read it there. If once a prince of an enlightened character should rise up, the first thing he would do would be to get rid of slavery. And he is pointing out something that the anti-Dundas people don't like to mention, and that is that Africans themselves sold slaves. Slavery was all over Africa and North America, indigenous people, South America, Asia. Slavery was in virtually all parts of the world, and it was very, very strong in Africa. When slave trade ships arrived at the ports, they did not have to go out and look for slaves to capture them. They were waiting at the dock. They just had to pay for them. It was a business, and that was a reality. But Dundas points this out, and the best way to end it would be if African leaders themselves would stop selling slaves. Well, he goes on to say many other things, but and so this is the 2nd of April, 1792, the day that he moved the amendment for gradual abolition. Immediate abolition didn't have a hope of passing, and at least he got the first motion through Parliament, which was against slavery. And so the young Dundas Square, at least the worst has been averted. Although the motion has not been rescinded, it's on hold. It could be brought back. And the full renaming of Dundas Street would have been terrible. The Sankofa Square name has not found favor with people in Toronto. Dreadful name, and especially since it comes from a society which itself was a slave society. And I propose that it should be called Slavery Abolition Square or Abolition Square in honor of people like John Graves Simcoe and his Attorney General, who brought in the first abolition law for slavery in the British Empire. 1793. John Graves Simcoe arrived 1792. He immediately recruited somebody to bring in a bill. The first bill was a good bill. There were slave owners in the House of Assembly, and so he watered it down. But at least it went through. And the process started that any slave who arrived in Upper Canada, once you cross the border, you're no longer a slave, which also is very important. That made Upper Canada, Ontario, a desirable, the real end of the Underground Railway, because you were safe there and could not be returned. So I think that these positive things should also be recognized. Yes, Britain was terrible for a couple of hundred years in slavery, but Britain is the country that got rid of it, and not just there, but in other places. So this is the legislation that came in 1793. Very weak legislation, but it started the process. And so the record on Dundas is absolutely solid, as it is on Ryerson. And I do want to spend a bit more time, because this is Friends of Egerton Ryerson. And the accusations, they are so much repeated. Whenever you see a story, it just slips in, that the university was renamed because of what he did to the residential school system. It's just been so widely accepted. I say, whenever you see it in the Globe and Mail or the Star, when they say it, not the National Post, of course, but when you see it in those other places, send a letter to the editor and say, you got it wrong. But we need a short-term and a long-term strategy to deal with the accusations against him at now Toronto Metropolitan University. And getting that dreadful plot down is certainly step one. And this is, the visuals are very important. This is where the old good statue was, and at the edge on Gould Street. And then you see, these are children's shoes. This was what was done at residential schools where where that equipment found, actually it's anomalies. They haven't turned up actual graves, but was thought to have large numbers, I think 215 graves in Kamloops. And to symbolize the loss of those children, the shoes were put up. Well, shoes are put up in front of Ryerson's statue, as if he had been running a residential school that was abusive. I mean, it's just absolutely appalling. And there you see his hands were painted red for blood. He killed children. I mean, this is how bad it was. And then the statue came down and it went off to Caledonia, minus the head. I don't think we've ever found out where the head is, or if it's back in the archives somewhere at Toronto Metropolitan University. So who was he? Well, we can't say it loudly or enough times that he was really the founder of public education, free public schools. We take it for granted. But at the time he started, very few children went to school at all. You had to have enough money to pay the fees, and no teachers were trained. So the schools, such as they were, would not have been very good at all. And he had a comprehensive approach, and it influenced school systems across the west of the country. You go through Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, and they got their first teachers from the Toronto Normal School, which is right near where young Dundas Square, Sankova Square, is. And he understood that teachers needed to be trained. This was new. They didn't do it in England either. And so he influenced so many people, and starting with elementary schools called common schools, and then going up to grammar schools, which are the high schools. And his fondness, his fondness for Indigenous people. This is from his journal. There are journal notes available. And if you're interested in following it, you can get The Story of My Life. It's in Project Gutenberg. So you can get it up on your screen and you can search. It's really a very nice way to follow him. I have now arrived at my charge among the Indians. I feel an inexpressible joy in taking up my abode amongst them. I must now acquire a new language to teach a new people. And he did learn Ojibwe. Apparently, he needed Peter Jones for the more serious things, but he could work in the language. And he commenced his labors. My heart feels at one with them. And he just loved being with them. My Indian brethren, forget about savages, my Indian brethren, he felt very, very close to his journal. And before long, he actually had to bury an Indigenous man there who shot himself while drunk. That happened just very, very soon on. And here, this is just December. He's only been there since September. And this week, trying to procure for the Indians the exclusive right of their salmon fishery. It didn't happen. But he is working on their side. He supported efforts, unsuccessful, to get land title. And they eventually gave up because they feared that they would spend so much time clearing the land and building houses, which Ron described, and getting farms. And there are pictures of these. And you can see they made a very good start. And he's out there and he's teaching them things like crop succession, things like that. He actually came from a farm background. So he had all these practical skills in carpentry and so forth. So that they were afraid they would put all this work into developing, their new life, farming and settling down, and they wouldn't have clear title and they could be kicked off. So, so they had to move, which is when they went to it's now called the New Credit. Not that there was another river there, but the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation near Brantford. The Ryerson University attacks on Ryerson are just appalling. I don't know who started it. President Latchney did not start it, but he jumped on the bandwagon very early on. And in 2015, the accusation of Ryerson's responsibility for residential schools went on the university's website. 2017, there's a page of accusations in the convocation booklet. So every graduate would see it, and their parents and so forth. And these are accusations. 2017, the Students' Council demanded the name change. 2018, report on community consultation. Oh, they're very big on community consultation there. And that means you have somebody who knows no history whatsoever. And they just ask people, well, what do you think? Oh, I think he was a creepy, and he started residential schools. Well, so that gets written down and that goes into the report. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And then 2018, the unveiling of the plot with false accusation, and it's still up. And there's going to be a petition here that to go to Toronto Metropolitan University, I invite you all to sign to say, get the plaque down. Okay? And so here's the unveiling. The plaque that's still up, if you're going by and it's still up, you could maybe heave a bit of mud on it or something like that. And then this is what it actually says in full. And it does recognize his work in education. It does do that. It says his recommendations were instrumental in the design and implementation. He's even more than the architect. He's actually been applying it too, which of course, but they didn't even start till after he died. And when he was with the Mississaugas of the Credit, they had a school there already. John Jones, Peter Jones's older brother, was the teacher there, entirely voluntary. He had nothing to do with any kind of system there. And then you get this the school, the children's school who were subjected to unthinkable abuse and neglect, to medical experimentation, punishment for their cultures and languages, and death. The aim of the residential school system was cultural genocide. Yes. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission never said that Ryerson was implicated in it. This is accusation by juxtaposition. Okay? If I said John Parker, sexist, Islamophobic, hypocrite, acts fraud, I didn't actually say I didn't actually say he did any of those things, but if I had a sign up in front of his house that said that, the neighbors might begin to think it if they walk past it every day for 3 years. So, I mean, it's just appalling, these accusations. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a very short blurb on Ryerson. It doesn't have accusations in it. And then here is Appendix B. When the Standing Strong Task Force, the outfit that recommended the name change and removal of the statue, they have an Appendix D, which has lots of good information and positive information on Ryerson. But their Appendix B, what we learned, the stakeholders, okay? And they list 109 names. 2 of them are of individuals, the MPP for the area and the city council there, and they sent in very negative letters. Sorry to say, I'm a fellow New Democrat people, but a lot of them got it wrong. And all the others were organizations. They're very respectable organizations. I thought, I would like to know what the Canadian Civil Liberties Association said about Ryerson. Well, I phoned them up and asked, but they never sent a briefing. What did QP say? What did OPSU say? They are large, large unions with research staff. If they're going to do a brief, they're going to do a good brief. And all kinds of groups. Well, when you actually added them up, there were only 86 different names. 23 of them were duplicates. And nobody particularly noticed. You wonder how much did the members of the task force write of the report, and how much of it was done by a firm hired by the university. And Appendix B turns out to be a bit of a fake. Now, and the report says that their process would be thorough, open, and transparent. Well, try access to information, and they resist. And I eventually got back. This took a very long time. And I got these replies. You see, they're all blank. They give their excuse, privacy, financial consideration. They give their excuse for why they're not. Page after page after page for these 109 names, and we get no information. It's just absolutely shocking. And when I finally went through mediation, they didn't budge on it. And when finally the actual report came through, that when they had to give it, it was sent in as an attachment that was entrenched. I couldn't even open it. And so what they finally did is they sent a redacted list of 234 comments. They were mainly by individuals. They weren't from CUPE, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and they didn't say we or our organization. And they were very, very, very negative reports. Len Fortune's excellent brief, and it's on our website, superb brief. He did photojournalism at the old Ryerson, and it's there. And there was one other very good pro-Ryerson brief, a detailed one with references, but the other ones, the negative ones, they tend to be very short. There were some people who wanted no name change. They thought that their degree would be cheapened by changing the name, but they had basically bought the argument. They said, but get rid of the statue. It was, all of that is quite nasty. And here is the worst contribution by a community member. Why are there no institutions named after Hitler? Oh, by the way, he used the residential school system in Canada as the blueprint for concentration camps. Can you just imagine? I mean, how far off they are, and nobody at the university twigs that this is our student. And he gets it that wrong. It's just so appalling. So what we want to do now in the Friends of Egerton Ryerson is to restore his honor. We're not trying to get the name change back again. They don't deserve to have his name, for one thing. And but they should acknowledge, as their own task force report acknowledged, that he made such an important contribution, and that should be recognized. I would like to see his Indigenous name recognized there, the Chihawk Commons. They got a big quad. Well, why not name it after him? There are very good portraits of Ryerson. They should at least have a portrait of him. It will take time for people to find out and accept that he really was an honorable, progressive man. I don't see those things happening very quickly. But the province of Ontario should honor him. I think that the Ryerson statue was raised by public subscription after he died, and it should be at Queen's Park, in my opinion. And he should be acknowledged in important places. I'd like to see the Toronto Reference Library. Yeah, that's one thing that hasn't been mentioned, but the public school system, there will be libraries at schools, but he also wanted people who learn to read, and everybody should learn to read. They should be able to continue to read. So he was in favor of free public libraries. So restore his honor also at Victoria University, where he was a founding principal and was treated so badly with these totally false accusations against him. And I would like to see the Ryerson Reference Library. Well, the Ryerson Reference Library, on 789 Yonge Street. Now, if you really want a rascal, Sir George Young is your man. And he actually made money from the slave trade, but that doesn't get mentioned all that much. But there's a petition here. Is it? Can you see it? Is it? John, I think some of you signed it. Well, I just have it in one page, but I would invite you to sign it. And Okay. So here it is, the petition to the Toronto Metropolitan University. President, can you see it there? And so that if you like it, sign your name there. And because we would like to move on to certainly getting rid of that dreadful plaque. And his statue, the decent statue should go up somewhere. And here is my final one. There are excellent portraits of him. So he should be honored even if there isn't a statue of him. His picture should be there. And there should be accounts of his very important contribution to public education, to libraries, to Indigenous people. He just made such an important contribution. And I say restore his honor. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, sir. You need my back.
With any luck, we'll have time for questions and answers later on, and I'll bet there's a whole lot of questions. Mr. Mayor.
Well, I guess I can do it right here. Oh, wait a minute, or can I? Oh, well, here we go. Well, the advantage of going last is you get to hear the historical facts from this distinguished group of Professor Emeritus and Professor Emerita. Well, I'm not exactly a Professor Emeritus, but I guess I could call myself a political emeritus. But most people, I think, nowadays say former politicians are has-beens. Anyway, I like to think occasionally that I can weigh in on a subject, and I weighed in on this subject because of this lady here. Lynn McDonald called me back in the summer and said, do you know that City Council, which you once served in, is about to continue with its discussion about the renaming of Dundas Street, which they had previously said they were going to do, and now is the time that they might do it. So she gave me some facts of the case, and as she and the others have mentioned, that really don't support the idea that Henry Dundas, in this case, was anything but an abolitionist when it came to slavery. He certainly was. I did a little more research myself just to say that I had verified some of these facts, not that I didn't trust them, but I wanted to make sure that I'd seen some words because, you know, he spoke in the court in Scotland. You can quote verbatim, and I did. I said, what he said was that he hoped for the honor of Scotland that the Supreme Court of this country would not be the only court that would give its sanction to so barbarous a claim. Human nature, my lord, spurns at the thought of slavery among any part of our species. The judges not only agreed, but they ended slavery completely in Scotland. Well, that in his words that are said, and certainly as a former member of Parliament, as both of us are, they're in the Hansard, they're in the official documentation, and again, supporting what he did. Now, where some people got off on the wrong track was they tried to suggest that his intent was in fact to prolong slavery rather than shorten it, rather than remove it in terms of British policy. But what he was doing, and I can understand this in the context of having served in public office, when you run up against a brick wall, you have to try to figure out, is there another way that you can accomplish the same aim? And his intent, as some suggest that his intent was to prolong slavery, but not at all. Because just a year before, in 1791, the motion by William Wilberforce to abolish slavery was badly defeated. So he said, well, let's do the next best thing. Let's try to make it more gradual, but still our aim is to eliminate it. And it did pass the House of Commons, but was unfortunately defeated in the House of Lords. Well, I think I would get repetitive by going into much more of that particular part of it, but that formed the basis of a letter that I drafted And also pointing out the appointment of John Graves Simcoe, who did carry out the anti-slavery law in Upper Canada, Ontario, as it is known today. I pointed out that certainly under the city's financial circumstances, there are more appropriate ways of spending $8.6 million that later became $12.7 million. So I put that letter together, and I then canvassed former mayor colleagues. We occasionally get together. If we don't like something city's doing, we interfere, even if they don't like it. I'll send them a letter, or sometimes we supported them in some of their fights with the provincial government and dug for it. But anyway, in this case, I circulated around, and two of the mayors came back and said they agreed to sign it. David Crombie and John Sewell, two people that I've served with and have known for quite a number of years. And I think it had an effect. It certainly aroused a lot of attention when it got to City Hall, because they hadn't really been thinking much about it. But now suddenly three former mayors were saying, no, you've got this wrong. You've got the facts of this situation involving Dundas out of context. So we then watched as City Council then came back recently and decided to put aside the renaming of Dundas Street. They didn't exactly cancel it out. I think that's a political move. I think it really is not going to reappear again. But they put it aside and they focused on the square and a couple of subway station renamings perhaps, and a library. So the main event though of Dundas Street, they decided to push that off to the side. I note the name they picked, Sankofa Square, which I understand is a Ghanaian name that comes from a tribe that actually once engaged in the slave trade themselves. But nevertheless, it seems to have a soft meaning about you're looking back, looking forward kind of thing, which doesn't seem to be too objectionable. And I think one of the reasons they did this was because they wanted to avoid any further controversy. They wanted to get this whole matter out off the table. They were beginning to feel embarrassed about getting the facts wrong. And so, because there had been a committee that came up with three individuals from the Black community that they felt would have been reasonable to name the square after. But that never saw the light of day. And I heard of other people that had other suggestions. One of them was Gord Lightfoot Square. And you know, there are numerous other ones. And I think the mayor probably wanted to get this out of the way. She's got other things she wants to work on. So it became very inviting to just put this name Sankofa on. She got some feedback that was very negative about proceeding without the Young Dundas Square Committee having considered the matter. A couple of them resigned, the chair, the vice chair resigned. But I think that was certainly her motive, and to just get this thing behind them. I hope we can get a couple of other things too behind, and that's this degrading of the name of Egerton Ryerson. I think what we've heard today is very clearly wrong, and even, you know, the word savage. There are words that had different meanings at different times. I mean, the English language has evolved enormously. We're familiar with it in Shakespeare's time because it still exists in his plays, but we've seen the language evolve, and the terminology can change. And so I think we have to be very careful about attributing intent or attributing language or values that we have today or the mores of today on people 100 or 200 years ago. Different kind of context. So we have to be very careful. And as we can see, it's easy to do them injustice. I think I would certainly sign the petition, and hopefully we can get that institution, which has the bland name of Toronto Metropolitan University, into recognizing Egerton Ryerson as the founder of the public education system in this province. I think also we haven't mentioned Johnny McDonald tonight. Maybe as a Liberal, I didn't think I'd mention him, but listen, he was the first prime minister of this country, and we wouldn't have a country, we wouldn't have had Confederation without him. Again, we have to be careful about trying to attribute current day thinking and values in going back to the day that he was around and running this country. I'm sorry to see, as I often do, if you go up University Avenue to Queen's Park, right at the head of Queen's Park, right in front of the legislature, the head of University Avenue, there's a big box. You notice that? Big box? It's about 20 feet tall or 25 feet tall, a square box. And it's been there for about, I don't know, 3 years now. Well, that's where the statue of Johnny McDonald is. Well, I think it's about time the province got rid of the box and took the statue inside, because if you leave it out there, it may have the same fate as the Egerton Ryerson statue. But I think it's about time they took it inside and continued. He wasn't perfect, but continued to honor a man who was the first prime minister of this country. So I think for all of those reasons, this is a good cause, and it's one that I'm happy to be associated with, and happy to know that there's still more work to be done. Make sure that we don't get into situations where we're constantly leaving people who haven't done their research, who distort the facts, who discredit the people who have been a key part of making this country what it is today, and not engaging in the kinds of things that they suggest they are. It's time to get these facts absolutely straight. So let's keep going and making sure the facts are properly respected.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you all. Questions and with any luck, answers. We have some time.
You on the screen up there?
Oh, okay, we'll take questions
The
from.
petition is there, do you want to sign it? There's only one.
There was a hand, put your hand up
Took it
again,
away.
Oh, it's not gone.
upper left-hand corner. Julie Bass.
Nicely done.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to compliment the speakers on their excellent presentations and just make one small suggestion. I feel that a better name for renaming Young Dundas Square in the spirit of opposing slavery would be Simcoe Square, in honor of John Graves Simcoe. Thank you. He was an abolitionist and responsible for keeping slavery out of Ontario. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. To be clear, tonight is not an evening to come up with a new name for institutions in town, but that's a fair point. That's Simcoe, for all of the things he's recognized for. I don't think he's satisfactorily recognized for that particular gift that he gave to Upper Canada. Rose.
A friend of Egerton Ryerson I work with, as well as the other two groups. Just to pick up on that suggestion, I know we're not here to come up with a new name for Dundas Square, but there was something in the National Post today about somewhere around 70% of Canadians are opposed to the current name that's been proposed for it, according to some kind of a poll that was taken, and also a petition is going around on that. But I want to speak to the points that Lynn made about how we might move forward in trying to restore the legacies of these two individuals, Ryerson and Dundas. And of course, taking down the plaque or having it corrected in some way is an important objective. And trying to find the remains of the statue and having it erected somewhere would make sense. But I think there's another possibility that we might want to seriously consider. I got an email today, and I sent it around to a few people about Ryerson's house on Dundas that has been slated for demolition. I worked with an individual on some associations, Adam Lynn, he's a PhD student here at the university, who spent the last 3 or 4 years trying to have that particular house declared historical. Now, if it was declared historical, it's right across from the square. It would be, I think, a wonderful place to house a lot of the material that would establish a resource center for just as actually what Ryerson and stood for, as well as Dundas. And Sue McCauley, who I know is here, has done some work on some research on the origins of this particular place. So that's just a suggestion I wanted to put out.
Thank you. Any more?
Okay. One of the questions really I think we haven't even discussed tonight is why these kind of programs, these kind of assaults go forward. I mean, quite frankly, there's a lot of people who had to sort of acquiesce and sort of say, okay, fine, I can go along with changing this because not to do it's going to disturb part of the community. So I think there's a serious problem. It's not only just with these two characters, but it's a lot of things that are going to happen. And I think we should try and sort of figure out why that's occurring in today's society. And the second point I want to say, if we are looking for another place to name Ryerson, I understand that there's a football stadium out in the west end of the city.
Maybe we could save that for another night.
Thank you. I have 2 questions and I'll try and make them brief. This is sort of to play off the question we just heard. The first being, how can we prevent this from happening again from the people on we're talking today? This seems to be an ideological movement. It's a political movement, and it's not going to stop at Ryerson and Dundas and McDonald. It's going to keep going. So I just want to hear from people who are in this fight. What can we do to protect the names of great men in history in this country and women in this country who will eventually be slated for the chopping block, as so many already are? Well, why don't I just leave with that, actually? That's my question for everyone presenting here today.
Who wants to take a stab at that one? Ron.
As I said earlier, the people who are behind this kind of thing are really 2 people. They're ones whose ancestors were subject to some of the things that have gone on, like slavery, residential schools, and so on. And the second group are people who feel guilty and a social conscience, and they're trying somehow to make themselves feel better by taking on these great causes. The problem is, of course, they don't know what they're taking on. They don't really know the facts. The only way I see to get at this kind of issue is to counter petition. Now, there were 14,000 people who signed the petition to change the Dundas name. That's a very small part of Toronto. I'm sure a lot of them, somebody came up to them and said, did you know this man was a supporter of slavery? Let us get rid of that name. So I think people have to speak up. They can't just sort of say, oh, this is awful. How could this happen? That's my take. Do you want to? No.
I think some people are bitter about the past, their own heritage, their own people. We've seen that in terms of Black Lives Matter. We've seen also the protests about the residential school system. But I think they're misplacing how they're trying to deal with it. They're going after names of people, doing very little research on it, and trying to cast the blame on them, trying to say that these were people responsible for colonial kinds of activities. And I think we have to keep showing the facts of the situation. And that it's wrongly placed. Yes, you can say that we as a society have not got everything right and things have been done wrong in the past and now, but to start attributing it to specific people without looking at the facts of the situation, I think is wrong. And we got to continue to say that. And if we do, then I think they'll be a little bit more careful about how they place their blame on the things that they don't like about how things were evolved in our society.
I think it's going to be a terrible battle in terms of education. Because the only way you're really going to be able to counter the impact of our television and of our media and our, whatever all those words are that I don't have in my vocabulary, is in education. And education curriculum, of course, starts with the government, unfortunately. And that's going to be the tough fight. How do you get Ryerson back into the education system? How do you get children to talk about what our history was like, as opposed to what others would like them to think the history was like? And that's, in my mind, the bottom line. And it's been a failure of education in many of the things that are my colleagues here and mayors have talked about. We're not doing the job. And I wish I could think of something better to say, but I tried.
It's founding an institute for historical.
So I did like the term that McDonald mentioned, which was fake appendix. And following up on the tack that they're all suggesting that we need more education. There's a good argument, I think, in Ellen Klein's latest book is a lot of what is going on is essentially fake news or fake information, and it's incumbent, I think, on the educated people to call out what is going on in rather strong terms of that sort. I don't know what the historians feel about that sort of role in our society.
Thanks.
One final word. I did send in response in conjunction with what you're saying, I did send notice to my former colleagues in the philosophy department at what I now call the Toronto Moo University. I did send notice of this evening's event, and I didn't even get a thank you from the chair. Nothing.
And one last thing, I follow this quite closely, not on social media, where a lot of this comes from. This support without knowledge. What I'm seeing is there's a reaction against it, that there are people speaking up, and it started really fairly far right, and it's kind of moving into the center now, where people are saying, come on, this is too much. You know, you're getting crazy. And there is hope that this will wear itself out, I guess. But we still have to keep after it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take a long time. When you look, I had a little bit of the time frame. In 2015 is when the anti-Ryerson forces really got going, and the name change wasn't, it was more than 6, 7 years. So it's going to take a slow process. And I just say, let's keep at it. Gilbert. Gilbert.
I'm going to take the microphone there and there. I'm just going to add my editorial comment. The thing that breaks my heart and drives me nuts is that this kind of thing gets into the drinking water. And you read columns in newspapers other than the National Post, which is paying attention to what Lynn is telling them. But other papers, you see a column where they say, well, let's get this straight. Let's fix this problem. There seems to be a whole lot of concern about Henry Dundas and Egerton Ryerson and so on. It's all nuts. Of course, we know they're scoundrels, but because they did all these terrible things, but let's put it in perspective. No, they didn't do those terrible things. So even the people who claim to be trying to set the record straight aren't doing their homework, and they're perpetuating the misconceptions. That's part of the problem that we're up against. I'm going to bring the microphone here, and then there, and then up there.
Thank you. Well, I agree with Ron. I think the reaction to a lot of this nonsense has started on the right, and it's drifting towards the center, thank God, too slowly. And my point would be that this is not really essentially about facts, and it's not really about Egerton Ryerson, and it's not really about Henry Dundas. This is an ideological battle which goes across a whole spectrum of society. It deals with gender ideology, with Indigenous affairs, with Black Lives Matter, and all sorts of things. It's a huge mix and cauldron. One of the common qualities of it is that the world is Manichaean. It's divided into two classes: those who exploited the evil ones and those who are eternal victims. It's a very dangerous ideology, particularly in a Canada where we try to compromise about everything. And it's an uncompromising ideology. And a lot of the people that you cited, including several academics at the University of Toronto and so on, are ideologues, essentially. Now, they may be right on a few things, and they certainly have passion on their side. But they are ideologues which we're not used to in Canada. I lived too long, perhaps, in Italy and France, so I'm very familiar with the type. It's an ideological battle. It has to be fought not only on the grounds of facts about Henry Dundas and Johnny McDonald and Ryerson, but it also has to be fought on the level of ideas. That dialogue is essential, that scrupulous research is essential, that looking towards facts is essential, that you have to be courteous to the people who oppose you, and all sorts of old-fashioned liberal ideas which are essential, I think, if a country as large, fragile, diverse, and developing as Canada is going to survive. Without openness, without the ability to compromise, without the ability to listen, we will not make it. And unfortunately, there are these ideologies, some of which are totally nonsensical, actually, which really do dominate public discourse at the moment in this country, and they're very damaging. So this struggle here, sorry, and I'll shut up soon, this struggle here is part of a much bigger struggle, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. I think those comments all are landing on fertile ground in this room.
I totally agree with your comments, actually. But one thing I'd like to say is I think we are the converted, or most of us are. And there probably is some aspect of our organization that should be looking at how we reach the Indigenous youth, who many of them at Ryerson are the people that were so easily led, I believe, into convincing them that this is a huge problem.
Thank you. And that defines one of the challenges that we face quite precisely. Now, I saw a hand up here before we started meandering.
I went to Ryerson for a couple of years in journalism. Everybody's always fighting each other within the institution. But my faith in the leadership of Ryerson has been really challenged. And I sort of, there's a board of governors there and there's a president there. And where's the leadership within that institution? I'm really quite disappointed in how they handled this.
I'm going to put in a commercial for Cornell University, because when the administration there capitulated to the same sort of uprising a generation ago, two of the best professors I had at the University of Toronto walked out of Cornell in disgust and came here and taught at U of T, and I'm glad they did.
Since I still work at that institution, my impression, and it's only an impression, is that the people who wanted to change the name went to the president and said, we want reconciliation, and if we're gonna have reconciliation, we have to get rid of this horrible name. And he went along with that. He made a presentation to the Board of Governors, and in about 20 minutes, they passed the whole thing, because they took his word for it. So this is somebody who thinks it's going to make the institution look better.
We're running out of time.
Well, at least they came up with an inspiring name for it.
Momo.
We're closing in on 9 o'clock, but we still have time. Any other questions, any other comments? I'm looking at the screen, I don't see.
Left-hand corner.
Oh, I see a hand, and I can't make out the name, but I think it's Brian. But you're on mute.
Hello, it's Rob Richards. Sorry.
Oh, really?
How do people online sign the petition?
Oh, I'm unmuted?
No, you're fine.
I've been trying to be unmuted for a while. I really liked the last guy who spoke, but I couldn't find who he was, because you have to put it in a bigger perspective. But about 20 minutes ago, I wanted to say, has anybody ever been to Ghana and seen the slave trade there? Read the Book of Negroes and find out, there's a couple of other sources about how Black people traded Black people to Saudi Arabia, all over Africa. Blacks were trading Blacks. And then ironically, we named the square after some Black people in Ghana who probably were the winners. I don't know. It's a mess. I'm not a historian. I'm historical, but I'm not a historian. Thank you. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the professionalism of you people. I'm not an academic. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, there's a reason why there's a lake north of the 60th parallel in this country called Great Slave Lake. Now, any other questions, any other comments? I'm looking at the screen. Oh, I see Rob Richards.
Yeah, that was very excellent and very well researched. But how do people online sign the petition?
The question is, how do people online sign the petition? What we'll have to do is figure out a way to get it to people. Lynn?
What we could do is if you're on the Friends of Egerton Ryerson mailing list, we can send it to, and then you just send it back. If you're not on the Friends of Egerton Ryerson mailing list, you should get onto it so that we can tell you about further events. And perhaps it could go out to the Canadian Institute for Historical Education as well, because it would be good to get a large number of signatures. But it is the petition.
Austin is saying that he get the list of everybody who's on and then send it to them that way.
Okay, but anyone who's here can sign it tonight. There's a piece of paper with it that you can sign.
And I'll just say, if anyone is curious about an article that was published, if anyone is curious about an article published in a Russian journal in favor of Egerton Ryerson, there's little teeny print in the bottom of this 4-page bit that I brought that has the code for the English translation. So if you're curious about that, and it was published in 2015.
So the bottom line there is send your pardon letters to either one of the websites, and we'll find a way to make things available to you. Maybe even I don't know the technicalities of things, but maybe the petition can be posted on the website. But one way or another, the websites, the two websites for the two organizations will put you in touch with what will get you to the petition.
Also, so we can get a copy of everybody who's on.
And everyone who's on record for tonight's event will certainly, we can get in touch with them.
Who's on the Zoom.
And everyone, too.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you all. But before we close out the evening, let me thank this young lady here. Carolyn Edgar has been working.
Leslie.
And, okay, there you go. Carolyn, thank you so much for all the work you've been putting in. And Rose Dyson, also a member of the board of the Friends of Egerton Ryerson. Thank you for your ongoing involvement. Thank you all so very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the panelists.